In this video, I'm going to show the basics of how to get started using Unity's new input system. This new input system works very differently than the old one, and there's many different ways to use it. A lot of the tutorials I find are pretty confusing for somebody just starting out with it if you're not strong at programming. So I'm going to keep this very simple and show you the easiest way I found to start learning how to use this system, and then you can expand on that and learn more complex features. So I have this simple little project I set up where it's just a ship that we're going to move around and use it to shoot a laser. So you can see here we have the ship we're going to move around. So the first thing we want to do is go up to the window menu. Let's go to Package Manager. And now we have to import and add the new input system. So in Package Manager, make sure up here it says Packages Unity Registry. And if it doesn't, just click on it and select it. And then in the list, if we browse down, it should be alphabetical. Just look for Input System. Select that one and then click Install. Now you're probably going to get a message either like this, where it's telling you it has to enable them on the back end and restart the editor. Or you might see another one where it's asking you if you want to select using both or only the new Unity input system. So if you get the other one, select using only the new input system. And if you get this one, just select yes. So now it's going to close Unity and then restart it. Okay, so now Unity's restarted itself and it's set up for the new input system. And then just before we leave this screen, if you select input system, you can see a whole bunch of samples here that Unity provides to learn the system a bit more. So feel free to experiment with these and learn on your own as well. So I'm just going to close out of here. Now, if you're familiar with the old input system, there is a bit more we have to do just for setup. In the old one, you can just start using it. In this one, we have to make our controls. So in our project here, I have this little folder I just put _game. This is where all the assets I created are for my game. I'm going to right click in here, go to create, and at the bottom you have an option here that says input actions. So we want to select that. That's going to create a file here that stores all of our controls. So I'm just going to call this controls. And now with that created, we can double click on it and it's going to open this window here where we can actually set up our controls. Now there's a few important things here. The first thing I like doing is I check autosave so I don't have to keep clicking save whenever I make changes. The first thing you'll notice here is at the top it says no control schemes. So I'm going to leave this for this video, but this is where you could make completely separate control schemes. So if you wanted to make a control scheme for keyboard and mouse and then a completely separate one for your gamepad, another one for say something like an Oculus or a VR device, you can set each one up individually, which can be very handy. For this one, I'm just going to add them all into the same control scheme to keep the video a bit simpler. Next, we have action maps. So I'm going to create a new action map here, and I'm just going to call this controls because I'm going to put everything into this one action map. But what you would want to do here is you could do something like, say, for instance, like a Far Cry game, if you've played any of those, where you can go from your FPS mode, and then when you hop on a vehicle, your control scheme changes completely. One button instead of shooting will be your accelerator, one will be your brake. That's where you can make the changes here. So instead of having to set that all up individually, you can set up a action map. One could be, say, walking or FPS mode. Another could be driving. And then when that happens in your game, you can switch that action map, and then all of a sudden all of your controls change. You don't have to worry about always checking these different options. So with actions, there's one created by default here, new action. So I'm just going to delete that, and now we have no actions. We can click the plus sign and it's going to create us a new action again. We can name it. So I'm going to name this one movement. Now for this action type, it's set on button. So if you're familiar with the old Unity input system, this is kind of like when you use get key down or get button. It's going to look for one press of a button or a key. I'm just going to change this. We're going to use value. And what value is going to do is value is going to constantly pass a value into the input system. So then every frame, it'll know the details. So for movement, we want to be checking that constantly. And then for the control type, it has button here. So we don't actually want a button because for movement, we want to be taking multiple directions. So we're going to want either the WASD keys, the 4 arrow keys, or the left analog stick on a controller. So what we want there is a vector 2. So if we select the control type, we go down to vector 2. This is going to give us a vector 2 of the input. And if you're not familiar with what vectors are, you may want to check out some other videos. I'm not going to cover all the details of vectors in this one, but the quick summary is The input's going to give you a vector2, which is going to be an X value and a Y value. So say if you're pressing fully up and to the right on a gamepad analog stick, that's going to return a vector of 1, 1. And if you were pressing fully down and to the left, it would give you a vector of -1, -1. If that doesn't make sense, make sure you check out a video on how vectors work, just so you understand how you're getting the input. Now with this selected, if we click the plus next to movement, these options are going to change based on what we have selected here. So because we selected a vector2, when we click on movement, we get an option to add up, down, left, right composite. And that's what we want. So we're going to select that one. I'm going to rename this to WASD. This empty binding here we don't need. I'm just going to select that and press delete on the keyboard. Now with WASD here, what we have to do is we just want to set each one of these buttons up. So if you look, it says up, no binding. So we have to set what the up key is. So what I'm going to do is on the right here, we have our path drop down. If we select on this, notice you can go through and you can browse through and select specific types of keys off different devices. But you also have this option to press listen. So if you hit listen, now Unity is waiting for you to press something. So in this case, I want to press W on the keyboard for up. And notice it finds that. So either it thinks either we press the W key or any key. So select W. We don't have to worry about anything else now. Now on down, we're going to do the same thing with the S key. So let's select path. We'll click it, listen, S. Okay, left, we want to do the A key. Also, another way is just using this search box. So if I type A, it's going to do a search on the letter A. And since it's one letter, it's going to show up right here, A keyboard. So there's multiple ways to find the key you want. For right, I'm going to do path. I'll do listen again and hit D. Okay, so now we have our 4 WASD keys set up. But what we want to do is also set up the other inputs for movement. So instead of having to check them individually, all we have to do is look for movement, and anything under here is going to count. So let's add another up, down, left, right composite. I'm going to call this arrow keys. We don't have to change any of the settings here. And let's do up. So I'm going to do listen. I'll hit the up arrow. See it, found it. Let's do the same. Down arrow, left arrow, and right arrow. Okay, so for our gamepad, let's go to movement again. Let's click the plus. And this time we don't actually need the up, down, left, right, because we're not looking for 4 different inputs. We're looking for one single analog stick. So let's do add binding. And then in the path option here, let's select that. And instead of pressing the button, I'm going to search for it. So if we go to gamepad, if you look here, it has an option right here, left stick. And that's exactly what we want here. So let's select the left stick. Notice it renamed it appropriately. So now we have all 3 of these controls. Okay, so let's start using these controls now. Let's close out of the input manager here. And let's go to the player character that I have created. So there's no player controller script on them. Nothing like that yet. We're going to create that. But the first thing we need to do is we need to add a script that's part of the input system. So if we go to add component and we start typing input, notice here you have one called player input. This is part of the input system. So if we select this one, this is going to make it so that this player character is listening for the input. So notice we have a box here that says actions. This is where we want to put our controls that we created. So this file right here, you can either click and drag this in, or you can click the little icon next to it here and then select it from the list. Okay, we don't have to do anything else there now. Let's create a script that we're going to use for our player. So I'm going to create a new C# script. I'm just going to call this mover. So this is going to be the script that handles just movement for the player, nothing else. And the way I'm doing it separate like this instead of a player controller is because we can then later use this mover script for enemies as well. We don't have to create multiple scripts. Okay, so double click on that to open in your editor. And I'm just going to remove start and update, and we're just going to start this very slowly here. So the scripting side of the new input system is where myself and most of the people I talked to started having confusion. I found a lot of the tutorials and the documentation, they all covered different ways to use it. There was no set standard way, which is a great thing about the new input system. It's very customizable, it's very powerful, you have lots of options, but that makes it a lot harder to learn than the old input system. So we're going to go about this the most basic way I know of. And this is just enough to get you in the door using this input system to start off all your projects and prototypes. But then you can use this to expand on it and actually learn to use the much more powerful ways of using it with C# events. But in doing so, that does require a lot more code and it gets a lot more confusing to start off. The thing that makes this method very easy is if we go back to our controls here. So I'm going to double click on controls. Now, if we look, we have this actions and we have movement. What we can do is we can actually get a method right in our script that's called anytime there's any type of movement. So at first, we're not going to know what the movement is. We're just going to know there was some movement. You need to make sure you spell it exactly like your actions here. So in my case, it's movement with a capital M. What you can do is create a private method. So we can do private void and then put on with a capital O in front of it and then the name of your actions. So we can do on movement. And now we have this private method called on movement. And you would think you would have to tell the input system how to run this movement, but you don't. So if we do this, let's do debug.log, and I'm just going to put movement. Let's close out of this, and we just need to add the script to our player. So let's add mover. Now let's run the game. We'll go to the console. And now, notice anytime I'm pressing some input, we see that value go. So I'm pressing the WASD keys right now. And then now I'm using the arrow keys. And now I'm using the gamepad analog stick. So notice we have 3 different input types all working to do the same thing. We don't have to distinguish the difference between them. The thing now is we don't know what was pressed. So we don't know how to add our movement. To do this, the input system has something built in where in our script, we just need to add using Unity engine .input system. And now with this, we have something where on our on movement, we can pass in a value to it. And we want to use input value, and then we can just call it anything we want. So I'm just going to call it value. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to call it input. So it's very clear. So now anytime on movement is called, which means we pressed one of those controls, it's going to pass in the value in this input variable. But remember, this input variable is of type input value. It's not just a number or a vector 2. So we have to get it out of this input value. So Unity has something built in for that as well. So we can store it right into a vector 2. So if we create a vector 2, call it whatever we want. So I'm going to call this movement vector. And then we can make it equal input.get. And then in here, we do it kind of like get component, except it's only get, and then we put the type in. So for this case, it's a vector 2 that we're getting. So we put in vector 2. Okay, so now we're getting the actual input values out of input. And we're going to store them in here. So now this is a real vector 2. So we can just debug this out. Let's debug it out to C. So we're going to debug.log movement vector. We're going to run the game. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do WASD keys. And even before I press anything, notice it's showing, it's outputting vector 2 0 0 when the game starts. Now if I press W, it's giving me vector 2 -1 and 0. I let go, and it gives all zeros again. I'm going to press W, so this is up. And now it's 0 and 1. Let go, it triggered again. So that's all working. I'm going to press the arrow keys, so left arrow. And you can see it triggered the -1 again. Right arrow gives me 1 and 0. And now if I use the gamepad, you're going to see it actually gives us analog values in between based on how far you're pressing the thumbstick. Okay, so let's make this player actually move now. So to do that, I'm just going to use a rigid body. I already have it on here. I just have gravity disabled and I froze some of the rotations. So I'm going to go into the mover script. And this part I'm just going to go a little faster on. This is the same regardless of the input systems. So if you need more specific tutorials on this, you can just check any out. That part won't matter. So I'm going to make a rigid body. I'll call it my rigid body. Okay, and then I'm going to make a variable. I'll make a private vector 2 and this is going to be input vector. What I'm going to do is every time there's input changes, I'm going to store it in this value. So then we have it every frame. Okay, and then I'm just going to make a float for speed in awake. I'm going to get our rigid body. So now in here, instead of this movement vector, I'm going to move that and do that in fixed update right away. But the first thing I'm going to do is this input vector variable I made up here, we want to put the input into that variable. So then we have it outside of this method. We'll get rid of that debug. We don't need that. So in case you didn't catch that, all we're doing is every time input's pressed, we're saving it here. So then we can access this inside fixed update. And I'm going to create a movement vector now, but this one's going to be a vector 3. We're going to do movement vector equals new vector 3. And then we're going to take input vector dot x, 0 on the y, input vector dot y, and that's our z. So now we have a vector of the direction we want to move. And I'm just going to change the velocity of the rigid body. So I'll do equals movement vector. We'll times it by speed. And in this case, I'm not putting time.delta time or time.fixed delta time, but usually you don't need it for the velocity, but it comes down to how you want to set up your game. So for this case, it doesn't really matter. This is just a demonstration. Okay, so this should all be working here. Let's go run the game and test this out. There we go. Okay, so that's the WASD keys. Now this is the arrow keys. All directions are moving. And then this is the left stick on the gamepad. So this shows how handy that input action can be. That one single action, and I have 3 different types of input I can use. So now we have that set up. I'll show you how to set up a button so we can do something where we're going to shoot a laser. So let's go back to our controls. Okay, and I'm going to add a new actions. And I'm going to call this one shoot. Okay, and now click the plus. We're going to add a bind. Actually, we'll use this binding first. So the first one here, I'm going to do a space key on the keyboard. So let's click this. We'll listen, hit space. Okay, and now I'm going to add another binding. And this one I'm going to do, so if you're using keyboard and mouse, I'm going to make this the left mouse button. So this one I don't think listen works on, so I'm just going to do, let's click mouse, left button. Okay, so we got that. Let's do one more. And I want to use the bottom button on a gamepad. So if you bring up your gamepad, you're going to notice something interesting here. It treats them differently. So if I press the bottom button, I'm using an Xbox controller, so I'm pressing A. It's going to give you the A button on the Xbox controller. But if you want it to not be specific to a single controller, you can use button south and then gamepad. And what this is going to do is it's always going to use that bottom button on the gamepad. So let's click that. Okay, so that's set up. So let's close out of here. Let's create a new script. I'm going to call this shoot. Or you know what, I'll call this, I'm going to call this blaster. So this will be the blaster on our ship. Let's go to the player. I'm going to add the blaster. And again, the reason I'm doing this, if you're not sure why I'm doing this instead of everything in one player controller. So with this blaster script is going to control how the player shoots the laser out of its blaster. There's no reason to have to rewrite all of that same code when we start putting enemies in the game. So if we do it this way where they're modular like this or components, we can use that same script for the enemy and the player, and we're just changing the data that we put in it. Okay, so let's open that blaster script. I'm going to delete these and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to test this out. So let's do private void on shoot. Remember the name of the action we made was shoot. So I'm just going to make sure this is working. So I'm going to debug out shoot. Let's go back into the game. I'm going to run this. Go to my console. Okay, so left mouse button, shoot. Space button, shoot. A button on the controller, shoot. Okay, so that's working. That method is running when it should be. So to actually shoot it, I'm just going to use serialized fields so we can see this in the inspector in the game. I'm going to make a private. I'm just going to do this as a transform. I'm going to call this shoot position. Again, this isn't relating to the input system, so you can always speed through this if you're familiar with it. Okay, and then I'm going to serialize another one. I'm going to make a private game object. And this is the laser that we're going to shoot. Okay, so inside of onShoot, I'm just going to instantiate a laser. I'll use the laser prefab. I'm going to put it at shoot position dot position and quaternion identity, which just means no rotation. So let's go test this out here. I'm going to select the player, go down to the blaster script. I'm going to drag in the laser. Oh, wrong one. Drag in the laser here. And then for the shoot position, I already have one created. It's just a little position in front of the player where I want the bullet to spawn, which is right here. Actually, let's move that up a little. Yeah, so something like that. So anytime we spawn a bullet, it's going to go here. So let's drag in shoot position. Okay, let's run our game and test this out. All right, so now every time I press the button, it's spawning that bullet. But the one thing is, if I hold down the button, it doesn't fire again. So it's only doing single button presses. So if you think about like the old input system, this would be just like doing your get button down or get key down. It doesn't check it every frame. It only registers when the value changes. So what we can do here is if we want it to always give us that data, we can actually do something a little different here. So again, we want to put the using Unity engine.input system. And then in onShoot, we're going to do the exact same thing. So input value, I'll just call this input. I'm going to comment out this instantiate for now. Just to demonstrate this, I want to make this more clear. What we have in this input value is you already saw how in Mover we can use input.get and then the type to get the type of value in there. Another option we have here is we can do if input.isPressed. So this is going to be true when the button is pressed down. And then if we do else, this is going to call anytime the value is changed. So the else is going to run when the button is released. So you got to remember this onShoot's not being run every single frame of your game like in the old system. This only gets called when something changes on the shoot input action. So if the button's either pressed or released. So here we're checking if this onShoot is called, was the button just pressed? Yes, do this. Was the button just pressed? No, then do this. And we can debug this out to show. So let's do shoot pressed. Copy that, and I'm going to put shoot released. Okay, so you see shoot was pressed. I'm still holding it, and when I release it, it's not saying shoot was released. Now you might think that should be working right off the hop like that. In the old system it would, but in this one, let's go to controls. I mentioned this a bit earlier. If we go to shoot, notice we have the action type set as button. So button is only going to be called when a button's actually pressed down. What we want to do, let's select this and let's do value. And now for control type, this is given all the different ones. I'm not going to go into all of the differences here because this video is going to be pretty long as it is, but we're going to select any. So it's going to look for any changes on this value. Notice we didn't change any code. Let's run the game again. Let's go to the console. Okay, so I clicked, I'm holding, and now I let go and shoot was released. So if we go back in here, just to emphasize that. So if you look on movement, we're doing this one by value too. We wanted always to register the change. And then same with on shoot. So if you're doing something like say a jump where you don't care if the button's being held down, you just want a single action to take place as soon as you press a button, that's when you want the action type to be button. There is another one called pass-through. It works very similar to value, but it does have some slight differences on that. I'm not going to cover that in this video either. I want to keep this to the very basics to not overwhelm you. Okay, so after that long explanation, let's go back to our script. And now we need to make this work. So what I usually like to do on something like this, using this method of input, is I'm going to cut this instantiate line. I'm going to make a new method here. I'm going to call this one, let's just call it fire laser. I'm going to paste in the instantiate here. And now I'm going to make another variable here. We could make it public or serialized so you can change in the inspector, but for now I'm just going to make it private float. I'm going to call this fire rate. I'll set it to say equals 0.25, so a quarter of a second. This can be how fast we fire. Okay, so when the button's pressed, I'm going to use the command. If you're not familiar with invoke, it has one called invoke repeating. And what invoke does is it's just going to call a method. So I'm going to tell it to call this one, but you can pass in other arguments here. So invoke repeating, if we put the brackets, notice you can see a few things here. You have the name of the method you're calling. And then we have float time, which is basically a delay for how long we want it to wait before it calls this method. And then a repeat rate. So we can set the repeat rate to our fire rate, and it's going to call that method every 0.25 seconds. So that's exactly what we want. And in here, notice it says string method name. So we got to put it in quotes. And this is where spelling has to be exact. So let's put in our fire laser method. And then for time, I want it to fire right away. So I'm going to put 0 for the delay. And then for the repeat rate, I'm going to use fire rate. Okay, so now that's going to start shooting every time. And then all you have to do in else when the button's released is just do cancel invoke. And I bet you caught the typo there when I mentioned it has to be the exact same spelling. That's on purpose here. I'm going to show you a little trick here. So let's go run our game. Okay, and notice it's saying it couldn't be called because it's typoed. It's the wrong method. That's the downside of using strings like this, is if you type them wrong, it's not going to work. There is a nice little way, if you're not familiar with it, you can use name of, and then in brackets. And then if you use name of, it's going to get the name of a string method, but it's going to give you autocomplete. So you don't have to worry about that. So if we do this, if we do fire laser, notice it's right here. We can just press enter and it's always going to be complete. So I like doing this way. Now you don't have to worry about actually typing that string reference wrong. Okay, so let's run the game again. And now I'm holding down the button and it's shooting. I let go, it stops shooting. I grab the gamepad, pressing A, same thing. And then spacebar. Okay, so that just barely touched the surface of how the new input system works. There's many, many different ways. If we go to player and then we look at our player input, notice behavior, it has this one called send messages. That's what we're doing, is behind the scenes, it's using something called send message, where it's sending that, in our case, movement and shoot, and calling those methods. So that's one way of doing it, the default behavior here. And there's many others. Invoke Unity events, invoke C# events. These are much, much more powerful methods that you can start doing in the future. But that's a lot more code heavy, and there's a lot more to understand on that. So I just want to make it clear that this is the very beginner basic approach to this. But I hope this helps more people start getting into using the Unity new input system. And then you can actually expand from there. And if you have ideas for other Unity basic videos you'd like to see, please leave that comment and I'll try to get to them.